Most people think childhood pain is easy to recognize. They imagine obvious neglect, constant conflict, or memories so painful that no one could mistake them for anything else. But psychology suggests that one of the deepest forms of childhood emotional neglect is often completely invisible. Sometimes it isn't what happened to you that leaves the biggest mark. It's what never happened at all. No one asked if you were okay. No one noticed when you became unusually quiet. No one stopped long enough to ask why you always seemed so independent. And over time, something inside you quietly adapted. Stay with me until the end, because the final habit isn't just the most overlooked. It may explain why so many adults spend their lives feeling responsible for everyone else's emotions, while secretly wondering why no one ever notices theirs. If you've ever felt uncomfortable asking for help, if you've ever smiled while carrying pain that nobody seemed to see, or if you've ever wondered why receiving kindness sometimes feels harder than giving it, this video might help you understand something about yourself that you've never had words for. This isn't about blaming parents. It isn't about deciding whether your childhood was good or bad. Psychology reminds us that children don't only need food, shelter, and education. They also need emotional acknowledgement. They need moments where someone looks at them and quietly asks, "Are you okay?" Not because they're crying, not because they're causing problems, but because their feelings matter. When those moments happen consistently, a child learns something incredibly important. My emotions are safe. My needs deserve attention. I don't have to carry everything alone. But when those moments rarely happen, children almost never complain. They adapt, because adaptation is what children do best. A child cannot change the environment, so the child changes themselves, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. The little boy who stopped crying because nobody came. The little girl who became the responsible one because everyone else seemed overwhelmed. The child who learned that being easy received more love than being honest. These adaptations often work beautifully during childhood. They reduce conflict. They keep relationships stable. They help children survive emotionally confusing environments. The problem is that survival strategies rarely disappear just because childhood ends. They simply grow up with us. Years later, they become personality traits. People call you mature, independent, reliable, selfless. But underneath those compliments is often a child who learned that asking, "Can someone check on me?" wasn't an option. And that brings us to the first habit, habit 1. They stop asking for help. Imagine two children facing the exact same problem. One immediately runs to an adult and says, "Can you help me?" The other quietly whispers to themselves, "I'll figure it out." Most people would call that child independent, strong, mature. But psychology often sees something different. Children aren't born believing they have to handle everything alone. They naturally seek comfort when they're scared, confused, or overwhelmed. That's how trust is built. But when a child's emotions are repeatedly overlooked, something begins to change. Maybe every time they cried, they heard, "You're fine. Stop being so sensitive." Or maybe no one asked anything at all. Sometimes silence teaches the deepest lessons. Over time, the child stops expecting comfort. Without realizing it, they begin believing, "My feelings aren't that important. I should deal with this myself." Psychologists often call this hyperindependence, a survival strategy where relying on yourself feels safer than relying on other people. At first, it looks like a strength. They become the child who never complains. The one teachers describe as easy. The one everyone calls mature for their age. But beneath that maturity is often a child who simply stopped expecting someone to be there. That habit follows them into adulthood. When life becomes overwhelming, they don't ask for support. When they're hurting, they go quiet. When someone asks, "How are you?" the answer is almost always, "I'm fine," even when they're anything but. Not because they're trying to hide the truth, because asking for help no longer feels natural. Ironically, these people often become the ones everyone else depends on. They're reliable, responsible, always willing to help. But when they need someone, they usually tell themselves, I can handle it, even if they're exhausted. One of the quietest effects of childhood emotional neglect is that the people who needed support the most often become the adults least likely to ask for it. Eventually, independence turns into isolation, not because nobody cares, but because they've become so good at carrying everything alone that no one realizes how heavy their burden has become. The child who stopped asking, "Can someone help me?" often becomes the adult who silently hopes someone will notice before they ever have to ask. And after years of ignoring their own needs, they become incredibly skilled at noticing everyone else's. That's where the second habit begins. Habit 2. They become everyone else's emotional caretaker. When no one regularly asks a child how they're feeling, that child often becomes incredibly good at noticing how everyone else feels. Not because they were born that way, because they had to be. Imagine growing up in a home where the emotional atmosphere could change at any moment. A parent's mood suddenly shifts. The house becomes unusually quiet. Something feels wrong, but nobody explains why. Over time, the child's brain starts paying attention to the smallest signals: a different tone of voice, a heavy sigh, a forced smile, a door closing a little harder than usual. Psychologists call this hypervigilance, when the brain becomes highly alert to emotional changes in the people around it. At first, it's simply a survival strategy. If you can predict someone else's mood, you can avoid conflict. You can stay safe. But childhood ends, and the habit doesn't. As adults, these people can walk into a room and immediately sense when something feels off. They notice the sadness hidden behind someone's smile. They hear the hesitation in a friend's voice before anyone else does. People often describe them as deeply empathetic, the friend who always understands, the person everyone feels comfortable talking to. And those qualities are genuinely beautiful. But they often come with a hidden cost. Because while they're constantly checking on everyone else, very few people are checking on them. They become the emotional support for everyone around them. Friends call them during difficult times. Family members lean on them. Coworkers trust them with their problems. They're always listening, always comforting, always making sure everyone else is okay. Yet when they're struggling, they rarely tell anyone. Sometimes they don't even know how. Another quiet pattern begins to appear. Whenever someone they love is upset, they immediately wonder, did I do something wrong? How can I fix this? They start carrying emotions that were never theirs to carry, because somewhere inside, they learned a painful lesson. If everyone else is okay, then maybe I'll be okay too. Over time, they become experts at understanding other people's feelings, but complete beginners at understanding their own. The child who spent years trying to read everyone else's emotions often grows into the adult who forgets to ask themselves one simple question: how am I doing? And when your entire focus stays on everyone else, it's easy to start believing that your own feelings don't deserve the same attention. That's where the third habit begins. Habit 3. They hide their pain behind "I'm fine." There are people who cry when life becomes overwhelming. And then there are people who become quieter. They still go to work. They still smile. They still show up for everyone else. If you ask them how they're doing, the answer is almost always the same: I'm fine. I'm okay. Don't worry about me. Psychology suggests this habit often begins much earlier than people realize. When a child repeatedly feels that their emotions are ignored, dismissed, or simply unnoticed, they slowly learn something powerful. Showing my feelings doesn't change anything. So instead of expressing them, they hide them. Children don't stop feeling pain. They stop believing it's safe to show it. As adults, that pattern becomes automatic. When they're overwhelmed, they don't reach out. They stay busy. They distract themselves. They convince themselves they'll get through it alone. Not because they're trying to be strong, but because vulnerability feels unfamiliar. Psychologists call this emotional suppression, a coping strategy where difficult emotions are pushed aside just to keep functioning. From the outside, These people seem incredibly calm, reliable, composed. Nothing ever seems to bother them. But emotions don't disappear simply because they're hidden. They often return as anxiety, emotional exhaustion, or a sadness that's difficult to explain. The hardest part is that people stop checking on them. Everyone assumes they're doing perfectly fine. After all, they never complain. They never ask for help. They never let anyone see them falling apart. Ironically, the child who wished someone would ask, "Are you okay?" often becomes the adult who makes sure nobody realizes they aren't deep down. They don't want people to solve their problems. They simply want someone to notice, without them having to say a word. But after hiding your emotions for so many years, another belief quietly begins to grow. You start feeling guilty for having emotional needs at all. And that's where the fourth habit begins. Habit 4. They feel guilty for having needs. Every person has emotional needs. The need to be heard. The need to feel understood. The need to receive comfort when life becomes difficult. These aren't signs of weakness. They're part of being human. But for children who are rarely asked, "Are you okay?" those needs often begin to feel like a burden. Maybe every time they asked for attention, the adults around them were too busy, too stressed, too overwhelmed. Or maybe they were made to feel like they were asking for too much. Over time, the child reaches a quiet conclusion. I shouldn't need so much. I don't want to be a problem. So they stop asking. Not because their needs disappear, but because they no longer believe those needs deserve space. That belief often follows them into adulthood. They hesitate before sending a text. They apologize for asking small favors. They think twice before sharing what's bothering them. Even when someone genuinely wants to help, their first instinct is, "It's okay. Don't worry about me." Psychologists often connect this pattern to low emotional worth, the belief that other people's needs matter more than your own. It's why these people can spend hours helping a friend, but feel guilty asking for 10 minutes of support themselves. They'll gladly listen to everyone else's problems, yet convince themselves that sharing their own would only make life harder for others. The painful irony is that they rarely expect perfection from anyone else, only from themselves. They believe they should be the strong one, the understanding one, the easy one, because deep inside, they still carry the childhood fear that needing too much might push people away. But relationships aren't built by pretending you don't need anyone. They're built by allowing yourself to be seen. The child who learned to hide their needs often becomes the adult who feels guilty simply for having them. And after years of believing your needs come last, you eventually begin to question something even deeper, whether you truly matter at all. That's where the fifth habit begins. Habit 5. They struggle to believe they truly matter. One of the deepest effects of childhood emotional neglect isn't that you believe people don't love you. It's that you quietly begin wondering, do I really matter? Not in dramatic ways. In small, everyday moments, you hesitate before sharing good news because you don't want to interrupt. You stay quiet during conversations because everyone else seems more important. You convince yourself that your feelings can wait. When a child grows up without someone regularly checking on their emotional world, they often learn to put themselves last. Not because anyone directly told them to, but because no one consistently showed them otherwise. Psychology suggests that children build their sense of self through repeated emotional experiences. When someone notices their sadness, their excitement, their fear, the child learns, what I feel matters. But when those moments are missing, another belief can slowly take its place. Maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe other people matter more. As adults, this belief becomes almost invisible. They celebrate everyone else's achievements, but downplay their own. They forgive other people's mistakes while being incredibly hard on themselves. They'll go out of their way to make others feel valued, yet struggle to believe they deserve that same kindness. Even compliments can feel uncomfortable. Instead of accepting them, they immediately brush them away. It wasn't a big deal. Anyone could have done it. Deep down, They find it easier to believe criticism than appreciation. Not because they lack confidence, but because they never fully learned that their worth exists independently of what they do for other people. The heartbreaking truth is that many of these people spend their entire lives trying to earn the love they should have never felt they needed to earn in the first place. The child who waited for someone to ask, "Are you okay?" often becomes the adult who's still quietly waiting for someone to make them feel like they truly matter. But here's what psychology reminds us. Your worth was never meant to be something you had to prove. It was always something you deserved to feel. And that's where the sixth, and perhaps the most important, habit begins. Habit 6. They find it hard to believe someone truly cares. Perhaps the quietest habit of all is this. Even when someone genuinely cares about them, they struggle to believe it. Someone checks in. They assume the person is just being polite. Someone offers help. They say, "You don't have to." Someone tells them, "I'm here for you." A part of them quietly wonders, do they really mean it? This doesn't happen because they're negative. It happens because their childhood taught them that emotional support wasn't something they could expect. When no one regularly asked, "Are you okay?" the brain learned not to rely on emotional reassurance. Instead, it learned to rely on certainty. And certainty meant depending only on yourself. As adults, this often creates an invisible wall. They crave deep connection. They want someone they can trust completely. But the closer someone gets, the harder it becomes to let them in. Not because they don't want love, because they're afraid of needing it. Psychologists explain that our earliest relationships shape what we expect from future ones. If emotional support felt inconsistent growing up, trusting it later in life can feel unfamiliar. So even in healthy relationships, they keep part of themselves hidden. They don't want to seem needy. They don't want to ask for reassurance. They don't want to become too much. Ironically, the very thing they've longed for their entire lives, they sometimes struggle to accept when it finally arrives. But here's the truth. The habits we've talked about today are not personality flaws. They're adaptations. They were intelligent responses to an environment where your emotional needs weren't consistently seen. And what was learned can also be unlearned. Healing doesn't begin the moment someone else finally asks, "Are you okay?" It begins the moment you stop ignoring that question yourself. The child inside you wasn't asking for perfection. They were simply hoping that someone would notice. So, if you recognized yourself in several of these habits, don't see them as evidence that something is wrong with you. See them as reminders of what you've been carrying for a very long time, because you were never too sensitive. You were never too much. You were simply a child who deserved to be asked one simple question. Are you okay? And maybe today, for the first time in a long time, you can honestly ask yourself that question and allow yourself to answer it if you recognize yourself in several of these habits. Take a moment before labeling yourself as weak, broken, or simply too sensitive. Psychology tells us that children don't choose these behaviors. They develop them, not because something was wrong with them, but because they were adapting to the emotional environment they grew up in. The child who stopped asking for help was trying to avoid disappointment. The child who became everyone else's caretaker was trying to create safety. The child who hid their pain was trying to protect their heart. These weren't personality flaws. They were survival strategies. The beautiful thing about survival strategies is that they don't have to become lifelong identities. Your past may explain why you became this way, but it doesn't have to decide who you become next. Healing doesn't always begin with a therapist or a life-changing conversation. Sometimes it begins with one quiet moment of honesty. The moment you stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What happened to me?" Because those are two very different questions. One leads to shame, the other leads to understanding. And understanding is where healing begins. So, the next time someone asks, "How are you?" maybe, just maybe, you don't have to give the automatic answer. You don't have to carry everything alone. You don't have to pretend you're okay every single time, because you are always worthy of being heard. You are always worthy of being comforted. And you are always worthy of someone looking at you and asking one simple question. Are you okay? If this video helped you understand yourself a little better, let me know which habit resonated with you the most. And remember, the goal isn't to become someone completely different. It's to give yourself the care you may have spent your childhood waiting to receive.